All right, the next thing we need to talk about before getting kind of back into Chinese history and learning about how the Yuan are going to fall is we're back in Europe, okay? And we need to talk about the Renaissance, which is something I'm sure many of y'all have heard about, okay? I'm talking to y'all during class. It seemed like many of y'all have done this, okay? This is going to be this time period in history in Europe, okay, between 1350 to 1550, okay? And the center of it's going to be Florence. Okay, so we're looking at this as Western Europe. Florence is the city in Italy. Okay, so definitely the core of it is in Italy. Um, when you get to junior year in European history, you're going to learn a lot more about the Renaissance. You're going to learn about the Northern Renaissance and the Southern Renaissance. But for now, you just kind of you need to know the gist, right? And if you Google this, the definition is the Renaissance is this time period in European history where there's a renewed interest in classical literature and art. Okay. Um, okay. Well, what is classical literature and art? Classical literature and art, we're looking at the literature and art of both ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Okay. So we're looking at the art from that time period and particularly literature. We're looking at the philosophers of those two eras. Okay. The big ones that we need to know from ancient Greece is Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. Okay, those are going to kind of be the big three. There are other ones, even in Rome, but those are the big three that you kind of need to know for this class. Okay, and historians have written a lot about the Renaissance. This has been an important topic in their writing, um, and there's been a lot of debate about it. Okay, on Schoology, I've uploaded a really good article that kind of goes into the historiography of this and kind of the debate of it as the historian kind of walks through. Some historians in the past have talked about this just isn't a artistic or a literary kind of movement, that this is the rebirth of European civilization. Okay, that this is the first time since Rome that we've really seen a cultured Europe come into existence. Okay, that this is the revival of European civilization, not just culturally, but politically and economically. Because after all, the Renaissance means rebirth. And there's a lot of debate and discussion amongst that. But historians, if we're being honest, if we just kind of cut to the chase, it really quite isn't that, right? It's not really the rebirth of all of European civilization. And even if in that statement itself, there's issues with that, right? Well, what about Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Reich? That was a time period for 50, 60 years in which you did kind of have civilized Europe return and pull itself out of the Dark Ages. Um, why is it just renewed interest, right? The other issue with this is the Renaissance is we assume that starting in 1350, well, Europeans just have access all of a sudden to all these classical literature and art that they hadn't in the past. We talked about how it was the Crusades that allowed for the diffusion, a lot of that. But even that's not true, right? Because under Charlemagne's rule and other kind of little kingdoms, you had these books and you had this interest, right? Um, but it was niche, right? So this is kind of an undercurrent that you had in European civilization. You had this interest in these things, but it was kind of like a small group, a very niche group that was into it. The Renaissance takes it and it makes it mainstream, right? And it becomes popular culture in Europe to have this interest in classical literature and art. And let's take those art forms and then let's make new ones that are inspired by that, which we're about to look at by a bunch of artists here who are going to take this art and it's going to be a continuation of kind of this classical Roman and Greek tradition. Um, and that's kind of the gist of what the Renaissance is, right? It's this artistic and literary movement. It's not the complete rebirth of classical Renaissance or rebirth of European civilization. And it's also not the first time that Europe had these things. It's just they're now so popular, right? They've always kind of been there, but now it becomes mainstream. Now kind of everyone is talking about it, right? So think about it at lunch, right? The Dark Ages, we're sitting in the lunchroom, and there's only two or three of us who are talking about Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, interested in these topics, okay? After the Renaissance, it's everyone in the lunchroom. This is what they're talking about. This is what they're into. It's gone mainstream, okay? It's gone, quote unquote, viral, if you'll allow me that cringe comparison, okay? Um, so that's it. Why are we going to talk about this? Okay, it's mentioned in the CED only once. Teachers are told to not spend a lot of time on it, which we won't. If it's just this artistic and literary movement, why are we going to care? Okay, this isn't a art history class. This is an art survey. Um, why should we care? And it's because the Renaissance culture is really going to affect human society, right? If we're honest, if you look at the biggest factor that controls how people live their lives and how people operate and what people believe, it all has to do with culture, right? So even though this is just kind of an artistic and literary movement, this is going to change how people view things and change how people think, right? And that's going to be huge because that's going to lead to a lot of other events down the road in this class. Okay, other events that maybe we've heard of, maybe we haven't. We'll talk about, but later. But I'll go ahead and say them. Right, without the Renaissance, would the Protestant Reformation have happened? Probably not. Okay, without the Renaissance, would the Enlightenment have happened? Who knows? Probably not. Again, the issue, with historians is we don't have a crystal ball. We can't really play these what ifs. If you've been paying attention in this class, you realize that historical events are not just caused by one thing. It's a web of causation that leads to things happening. But there's a really weird, really real scenario where if the Renaissance didn't happen, uh, the Protestant Reformation wouldn't have happened, the Enlightenment wouldn't have happened, and if those two things didn't happen, then America wouldn't have happened, right? So that's not something that you'd write on an essay or an SAQ because that's definitely assuming a lot of other things wouldn't happen that would cause for these things to take place. But this is going to be important, right? This is definitely going to change kind of the world that we live in and the world that we know. Okay. Before we start looking at some of these artists, we need to talk about humanism. Okay, this is going to be the biggest change, okay? And it's within the Renaissance. You have this humanistic idea, okay? And it's this intellectual movement that focuses on human issues rather than religious ones, okay? Um, this is huge, okay? If we look at the Dark Ages, if we look at culture in Europe during medieval times, it all had to do with religion. Everything had to do with Catholicism. Everything had to do with salvation, right? It all had to do with God. It was it, right? Everything that was the only cultural continuity we saw. That was the complete structure of their life. That was the focus of everything. Okay, it was all um, uh, basically non-secular. It all had to do with religion. The Renaissance is kind of the first break in that, right? Catholicism will still be the centerpiece in European history, but now we're going to see that we're going to begin to kind of look at, well, what does it mean to be a man, right? What does it mean to be a human? What is the human condition like? Okay, and like we said, this is going to pave the path for a lot of other things. Okay, um, so again, humanists are going to study classical culture of Greece and Rome. That this classical literature is going to focus more on the human quality rather than the religious one. Okay, so study the humanities. That's where we get the word from: humanism, humanities, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history. We're going to look at man. We're not going to study religious issues. We're not going to study theology. We're going to study what does it mean to be man, right? What are these feelings in the poetry? What is human history? What conclusions can we draw? Okay, but then humanism, they take it a step further. It's not just this intellectual movement. It's this intellectual movement that has action, right? Well, let's take what we know and let's try to apply to these topics in modern times and let's make it relatable. Let's not just be like, oh, way back then, blah, blah, blah. It's let's apply this idea to modern times, okay? And this is going to be kind of a fundamental shift in European thought and European view, right? Catholicism is still going to have a huge hold over kind of how people view things. But we're going to look at this as kind of the beginning shift. Okay. One of the first artists that we're going to look at here, that we're going to look at two of his works is Leonardo da Vinci. Okay. You've probably heard of him. Very famous. Here's a woodblock printing of what he supposedly looked like. Okay, the first piece of artwork that you need to know by Leonardo da Vinci is the Last Supper. Okay, this depicts the Last Supper Jesus had the night before his crucifixion. You see him here, okay, and you see him with his 12 apostles. He's having dinner. He's breaking bread with them. Okay, this is where he tells them, "Hey, look, the bread is my body, the wine is my blood." And you see here, he's just told the apostles that one of you will betray me, right? And you see the apostles freaking out and talking. What is Jesus saying? You know, he's not making any sense. What do you mean one of us will betray him when we're all his followers? Um, Again, so this is a religious piece of art. Okay, so technically this is non-secular art, but the focus isn't on theology. The focus isn't on how do we see God and portray God as his grandeur and all powerful. The focus is on it is within the human aspect of this, right? So again, even though this is a religious piece of art, we're looking at the humanism within it. Okay, pretty much all examples I'm about to show you are going to be examples of religious art. Okay, um, well, that seems to not make sense, Mr. Bennett. You just said we're moving away from religion with humanism. We're looking at human qualities. Why do then a lot of these artworks seem to show religious scenes? It's because the majority of these artworks are being paid for by the Catholic Church, right? And if the Catholic Church is the patrons of the arts, the ones who are paying these arts, then it's going to depict religious scenes. Okay, but what's important here is the human quality within these religious scenes that we're now kind of beginning to see, right? We didn't really look at a lot of art within the Dark Ages because really not a lot of them is being made. You maybe saw a couple pieces on your test with regards to kind of Muslim art, religious or Muslim art, or even Christian art. But it all had to do with theology. It all had to do with kind of religious practices, right? It all had to do with the teaching of that religion. Here, it has really nothing to do with the teaching of religion. We're looking at the human quality, the human aspects of the apostles. Okay. Um, the next one, the most famous piece painting ever in the Louvre today, Mona Lisa. Okay, you've probably heard of this. This is also done by Leonardo da Vinci. This depicts an Italian noblewoman. Okay, so again, nothing to do with religion, focusing on kind of the human quality here. Um, Later, we'll talk about. Wait a minute, if the Renaissance is primarily happening in Italy, and Leonardo da Vinci is Italian, and Mona Lisa is an Italian noblewoman. Why is it in a French museum? It's because of that man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's totally going to steal it in the 1800s. And we'll kind of talk about that later, but for now, it's a little trivia fact for you. Okay. The next guy you need to know is Michelangelo. Okay. Here's a painting of what he supposedly looked like. This is another artist we need to know. Okay. Michelangelo sculpted David. Okay, so what biblical scene is this? This is David and Goliath. Okay, many of you are probably laughing. Why is Mr. Bennett not showing us the whole statue? Why is it just half of the statue? Why is this statue cut off? You know, why is he not showing us the rest? This thing's huge. It's like 20 feet tall. Why is he only showing us half of it? Because David is completely naked in this. Okay, so humanism, you had a lot of nudity. Okay, that's something that dated back to ancient Greece and Rome. Um, it wasn't sexualized. It was just this is the human body. It's beautiful for what it is, but we're not going to sexualize it. Um, okay, so that's kind of interesting. But you know, again, here we go. David and Goliath. This is a religious piece of art, but this all has to do with man, right? Look at his hands. You can see the tiny bones in his hands. You can see the veins in his arms. Okay, this is all just carved out of marble. You can see his abs. Okay, this would have taken forever as you start with a big block and then just hammer and chisel. Okay, so again, more human qualities. But this is a portrayal of man. This is a portrayal of David, not of God. Okay, now this is another trivia fact, but this is really good. Kind of funny. Okay, Queen Victoria, she's going to be the queen of the United Kingdom in the 1800s. So we're jumping way ahead. She's going to want all this Renaissance art from Italy to come to England, to come to the British Isles, so the British population can be educated and cultured and have seen it. Okay, well, you're not going to move this famous piece of heavy marble. So she has these guys make a gigantic cast of it, okay? And they're going to make a cast of it, and then they're going to make a copy of it, and it's going to be a high quality copy that then will be displayed, put on display in the British Isles in London, so the Brits could go and see it and be like, oh wow, that's the Renaissance art. You know, we've learned about that in class. This is what it looks like. This is furthered art education. Well, the guys that were doing this and putting this on and knew the Queen were coming this is your Queen, right? And then Queen Victoria will earn the nickname Queen Mom because she's going to have all these children that will have children that go on to rule all these monarchies across Europe. So that she's definitely this motherly like figure to kind of all the British people. Okay, the Brits in general, they seem to when they have a queen, they kind of want to be overprotective of her and kind of are very kind of guarded of her. So these guys are freaking out. They're like, well, this dude's naked. Like we can't expose the queen to that. So they're gonna go and they're gonna hire this artist to create this really big like fig leaf that they're gonna go and like hang over David. So when the queen comes, it won't be this issue where mom has just seen the naked man or whatever. So that's kind of a trivia fact for you. That's just hilarious. If you go to the Albert and Victoria Museum today that has all these molds. They have the mold or the copy of David, and they actually have the fig leaf. You can go see it, and it's it's just a funny story. Okay, um, probably my favorite of all of this that shows this human aspect of this in this religious art is the Pieta. Okay, this is also done by Michelangelo, carved out of a gigantic piece of marble by hand, hammer and chisel. How did he do it? I have no idea. Let's just look at the sheer detail. Okay, and this is depicting the Madonna holding Jesus Christ after he's been crucified. Okay, so this is the Madonna is not this '90s pop singer. This is Mother Mary, and she's holding her son dead in her arms. Again, this is a religious piece of art. Okay, so this is non secular art, but what is the focus? It's not on the glory or grandeur of God. The focus of this art is the sadness of a mother losing her son, right? Look how sad she is holding her son dead in her arms. Okay, so this is again humanism. We're looking at the human quality, the human aspects of this. Yes, this has to do with religion, but the focus isn't on theology. The focus isn't on what do we believe about God. The focus is on, look, this is man. This is the human condition. Okay. You might have also heard of Michelangelo because he was the one who was hired to paint the Sistine Chapel. Okay. So this is it. The Sistine Chapel is this chapel in Vatican City, which is in Rome, Italy. Okay. And the story is he's basically going to spend years doing this. He's going to go blind as he's literally basically on scaffolding upside down painting these walls. This is probably the most famous one that you've seen recreated. Okay, again, religious art, but it's depicting of man. Okay, and it's kind of another fun trivia fact for you, right? For hundreds of years, they were lighting these candles and burning these candles in um, uh, the chapel. Okay, that's a part of Catholicism. Um, Especially with prayers, sometimes to get you'd go, you'd say a prayer, you'd light a candle, and that kind of symbolized that you've just said a prayer for someone. So hundreds of years of candle smut being put off, getting on these walls. Okay, a couple years ago they restored it, and look in the difference in colors. Look how more vibrant this is compared to this. Okay, and a lot of people freaked out. They're like, "What do you mean this isn't what Michelangelo? These aren't the colors he used. Y'all ruined it in the restoration." Which it wasn't true. It's just they had never actually seen what he had painted. Okay. So that's the Renaissance. We'll be referencing a lot this year. Definitely do need to know kind of its importance and definitely need to know that what allows them to what popularizes this, what exposes a lot more Europeans to this, that makes this type of humanistic art go more mainstream, is the Crusades, right? Because they went over there and these Crusaders interacted in the society that had all this ancient Greek literature and art and were exposed to it in the Crusades because the House of Wisdom preserved it. And therefore, when they came back, Europe technically already had it, but it was niche. But since now a whole bunch of group of people have been exposed to it, it becomes very popular and very mainstream. It becomes vogue, if you will. And for now, that's kind of all we're going to say about the Renaissance.